Let's talk about triangle pose and talk about the anatomy behind the pose, because that's going to lead us to the cues we can use, but not just repeating cues. When you understand the anatomy behind the cues, then when you share them, you understand the why. And that allows you to share the cues with so much more confidence and clarity. It allows you to rephrase the cue if you see someone's out of alignment. So this is a much more powerful way to share cues than simply repeating, but you need to understand the anatomy and how to apply it to movement. When we look at triangle pose, like with every posture, there's a number of different joint movements that are happening. So let's first take a look. If I was coming into triangle with my right leg forward, so this. Let's take a look at the different joint movements, and we're going to stick with major joint movements. So we've got both arms out to the side, which is shoulder abduction, okay? The next thing is we have both hips out to the side, which is hip abduction. But this hip also is an external rotation, and this hip is an internal rotation. We have two straight legs, which is two knees in extension or bilateral knee extension. And then we take the spine and we tip it to the side, which is lateral flexion of the spine. So let's just first take a pause here, and I want you to just check in with yourself and see if you knew the different joint movements, because a lot of teachers teach to the shape because the shape is defined through thousands of years of history, but they're not exactly sure, well, what are the joint movements happening in the pose? So for instance, when I said this back hip is internally rotated, did you know that? Because some teachers might think this back hip is an external rotation. But keep in mind, the alignment or the anatomical movements of the pose connect to the shape. And the shape is what the shape is as defined through thousands of years of history. Now, if you wanted to teach triangle pose with the back hip and external rotation, you could do that if you had a reason to do it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense because that's not the pose. So I want you to just check in with yourself first and see how you're doing at this point in the conversation. Because understanding what the joint movements are allows you to understand what are the muscles that create those movements. So if we go back and we say both shoulders are in abduction, the primary muscle of abduction is the middle deltoid. It's the middle part of the deltoid, which sits like a cap sleeve over the shoulder capsule. If we look at both hips in abduction, abduction of the hip is done by the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus on the lateral aspect of the hip. If we look at this hip, also in external rotation is done by muscles on the posterior hip, like the piriformis, the gemelles, the obturators. If I look at this back hip in extension, primary muscle of hip extension is the gluteus maximus. This hip, like we said, is also internally rotating, and that's a function of the tensor fascia lata, and the TFL is on the lateral aspect of the hip. We said both knees are in extension. Knee extension is done by the quads. And then we said the spine is laterally flexing, and lateral flexion of the spine is done primarily by the quadratus lumborum, which sits on this little area on the lower back and connects the top of the pelvis to the lower rib and all these lumbar vertebrae. And its main job is lateral flexion of the spine. So now let's do a check-in. Were you able to connect the joint movements to the muscles that create those movements? That's step 2. And then step 3 is, well, how do I apply it to teaching? So let's say a common misalignment you might see is someone like this. So in this case, this hip is in internal rotation, but you know this hip should be in external rotation. So what you could say is bend your front knee, tuck your right sitting bone under, and roll your inner thigh out. And that'll create external rotation. What about this aspect of it, the upper body over the front leg? Well, this brings up something I missed earlier, which is not only are the shoulders are in abduction, they're also in external rotation. And external rotation of the shoulders is done by the teres minor and the infraspinatus, which connect the scapula to the humerus. So to correct this, you need to get this shoulder out of internal rotation into external rotation. And the easiest way to do that is to have them put the block behind the leg. So now they can lean back, thus opening the shoulders, and both shoulders are now in external rotation. So that's just one example of applying anatomy to movement, but I want you to realize we had to start at the beginning of the story, which is what's the pose, what are the joint movements, what are the muscles creating those movements, and then how do I share it in my cues, and how do I correct someone who's out of alignment. So this is part of a series I'm doing this week. It's the week of August 17th, 2026. If you have a posture you'd like me to review, just post it in the comments.